Hey, it's James from 4x4 Earth, and welcome to track 28 of the 4x4 Earth podcast. Is diesel dead?
Join James from 4x4earth.com as he learns all there is to know about four-wheel driving, camping, fishing, and getting out and exploring our great country on the 4x4 Earth podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you got a lot out of the Why Caravans Crash podcast, where we spoke with Mike Clayton from Clayton's Towing. That has been one of our most popular podcasts ever. Very quickly had thousands and thousands of downloads, so very exciting about that one. This one I think is going to be really interesting, quite topical for a lot of people. I'm a big fan of diesel engines. My last three vehicles have been diesels. Robert Pepper from Practical Motoring is saying that we may not be able to buy them for too much longer. So let's have a quick chat to Robert and find out why he would say that. Hey, Robert, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much, James. Always a pleasure to be here.
So I've always thought of diesel as being simple, reliable, and really, really efficient. My last three four-wheel drives have been diesels, and I've been really, really happy with them. But you think that diesel's dying out. Why would you say that?
Good question, but there's a whole range of evidence out there to say that it's dying. And you're right, diesels were old, reliable, simple, but that was back in the day in 2017. That's far from the case. And to really answer that question, we've got to go back a little bit and look at the two main factors which are driving car development these days. One is safety, which is ever-increasing safety standards, and the second one is emissions. And emissions regulations get tightened up every 3, 4, 5 years, and they get tightened up quite dramatically. And basically, diesel isn't going to be able to meet those emissions, and not only that, there is a good alternative to it with petrol electric hybrids.
What's some of the complexity that's come into diesel engines? Why aren't they as simple as they used to be?
There's a lot of them because, back in the day you'd say, oh, look, diesels are simple, they'd run underwater, you disconnect the battery, it keeps going, all of that. Yeah, no longer. You try running a modern diesel without disconnecting the battery, it's going to have a problem. So you've got fairly complex technologies like common rail diesels, where you basically pressurize the fuel up to 15,000 psi and inject it under very precise computer control into the combustion chambers, and that's good. That's good for efficiency, and that's good for power, for torque, and quietness, and all of that good stuff. But it's extra complexity. But that's not really the problem. The problem with modern diesels is that there are several technologies now which do nothing but add complexity and therefore potential for unreliability to the engine purely in the name of emissions. Now, don't get me wrong, emissions we need to get them down. We absolutely need to get them down, but it's not good from a full driving reliability perspective to have systems in your vehicle which aren't necessary to the production of torque at the wheels and which, when they fail, could leave you stranded.
And so what are some of those things?
We start off with, let's go for the whole cycle then. So we've got the common rail diesel there, which isn't really the emissions thing per se, although it does help. Then you've got EGR, exhaust gas recirculation. And that's when you take some of the exhaust gases and then you route them back into the engine itself. And the reason you do that is so it dilutes oxygen, and that lowers the combustion temperatures, and then that lowers the amount of pollutants which are being produced. There is a small efficiency loss when that's done, but again, that's done for emissions purposes. Then you go through to the catalytic converter, which is relatively simple. There's 2 or 3 different chemical reactions going on in there, hence the term three-way catalytic converter. So one of them is where the nitrous oxide is actually broken down into oxygen and nitrogen, which are fine because we breathe that all the time. And the other one is where you add oxygen to it, and then that reduces the carbon monoxide. So you've got a catalytic converter there. Then after that, you've got the DPF, or diesel particulate filter. Now, one of the problems with diesel is that it has in its exhaust very tiny particles of matter, and they're called particulates, and those are actually a type 1 carcinogenic, which means that they directly cause cancer. So you can see why World Health Organization and others are dead set against diesel. Anyway, these particulates are captured in a DPF and it fills up a bit kind of like ash, if you will, and every so often it needs to be burnt off. And that's literally what happens. A lot of heat is generated. I recently measured a Toyota LC 79 series and its end of the exhaust was up to 180 degrees. Imagine what it must have been like closer up to the DPF itself. That's literally burnt off. Then we have the latest invention, which is SCR, or selective catalytic reduction, which is otherwise known as AdBlue. Now, AdBlue is actually a brand name for a type of SCR, but basically with SCR, what's happening is that you have something called DEF, or diesel exhaust fluid, that's injected into the exhaust, and that converts your nitrous oxide into nitrogen and water, which makes it relatively inert. It's a reasonably simple system, but then it's another tank to carry around. A Ford Everett, for example, has a 20-litre tank, a DEF tank on it, and I think most of us would rather carry 20 litres of water or 20 litres of petrol or diesel than 20 litres of DEF, but that's where we're at. So that gets injected into the exhaust and makes it cleaner. So we've got several different technologies in diesels now, which really kind of destroy this simple, reliable diesel concept.
So a 20-litre tank, how long would that last for?
Really quite varies. Anywhere between 1% and 4% of AdBlue is used compared to the same amount of diesel. So it could be thousands of kilometres or tens of thousands. Really depends what sort of work you're doing with the vehicle. But you're not really going to run out of that in the middle of the desert because, as long as you fill it up before you go on a long run like the Canning or the Simpson or something along that nature, then you'll be fine. So it's not something you really need to worry about running out, but you do need to pay attention before you leave on a trip, I would suggest, particularly because most vehicles don't have a gauge on it, so you can see how much you've got. They only tell you when you're running low. Now, one of the concerns which is being raised has been, what happens if I run out of AdBlue or DEF, as it's more correctly termed, and what happens then? Well, the answer is the car's engine will continue to run indefinitely, but when you switch it off, you can't restart the car. And that is not a manufacturer design thing. That's actually part of the Euro 6 emission statement saying that, look, if you've run out of AdBlue and then you switch the car off, you're not allowed to restart it till you've got some back in the system.
So that could be a potentially significant problem if you've gone out driving and haven't thought about topping that up before you head out.
Yes, that could be an issue. I think in the scheme of things, it's probably a fairly small risk, though, because the DEF AdBlue system is pretty reliable. It's been used in heavy machinery for a while. But again, it's just something which, all else being equal, we prefer it wasn't there. And then for the petrol engine, you don't have it. It simply doesn't exist. Petrol engines don't have DPFs either. They've obviously got caps and you can put an EGR on them, but they don't have DPFs, they don't have AdBlue, nor do they generally have turbochargers, and you don't generally have intercoolers in them either. Again, all of this stuff is a lot of it is pretty reliable, especially stuff like intercoolers, but it just takes up extra room in your engine bay and it starts to make everything a bit more complex.
Definitely. Is this why we had Dieselgate? The amount of complexity to try and stay within these emission guidelines? Is this why VW and all of the other companies? Because it wasn't just VW, was it?
No, it wasn't. Look, that's a really astute question, and I believe that is actually pretty much the case. I mean, look, the real reason was obviously dishonesty on behalf of Volkswagen and so forth, but you've got to ask yourself, why would they do that? Well, the answer is because they looked at these really, really stringent emissions requirements for geez, how are we going to meet them? And that's what basically pressured them into cheating. Now, I'm not in any way, shape or form excusing what they did. It's reprehensible and they deserve all the kicking they're going to get. But yeah, look, there's no question when you've got sort of targets of that nature to go through, it is quite hard to meet them. So to give you an example, the main emissions targets we're talking about here are the Euro standards, which is coming from the European Union. There's the other big sets of standards are the EPA ones out of California, particularly in the USA. So to give an example, the Euro standards came out in July 1992. The latest one, that was Euro 1. And the latest one is Euro 6 of 2014. And through that time you had Euro 2, 3, 4, 5A and 5B. So back in the sort of Euro 3 days, and that was only back in 2000, you're allowed 0.5 milligrams per kilometre of nitrous oxide emissions. Now, that's dropped down in the latest standard to 0.08. So you can imagine what sort of reduction that would be. And pretty much all of the other sort of pollutants, they're dropping down by that sort of factor, sort of a tenth, a fifth. And think about it this way. Imagine that you're living in your house and someone said, look, you've got to reduce your electricity usage by, I don't know, let's say 50% in 2 years, and then another 50% after that, and then we want it halved again 2 years after that. What would you do? You'd go nuts trying to figure out how you're going to meet those sorts of targets. And that's what the engineers are up against here. That's why emissions is such a big, big focus for vehicles. And diesel, frankly, just can't meet it going into the future.
That's really quite scary, isn't it?
Well, we should talk a bit about why diesel's so particularly bad. So any internal combustion engine is going to obviously produce pollutants, and that's just the nature of any form of combustion. But diesel produces quite a few which are bad. You've obviously got your nitrogen dioxide, and that's a very poisonous gas, which is a byproduct of fuel being burned at high temperatures. Then you've got your CO2, your carbon dioxide, which is obviously pretty lethal as well. And then we've got the particulates we talked about there, and those are your Greek-born carcinogens, which directly cause cancer. And the interesting thing is, in Australia, we are so lucky in many, many different ways, and you kind of don't realise it till you step outside of the country and live somewhere else for a bit. But one example of where we're lucky is I used to do a lot of light aviation flying south of London, and sometimes you'd take off and you look towards the south, which was heading out towards France and Brighton, that sort of area, and it would be nice and cleared, and you'd head point the aircraft north towards London, and then you'd see this just massive brown, horrible smog over the city, and you'd think, yeah, God, I've got to go in there next week. That's disgusting. Now, we don't have that sort of problem in Sydney or Melbourne, our biggest cities here. But you know what? Even London is pretty damn good by a lot of worldwide standards. This air quality is not bad compared to a lot of developing countries there. And that's why there's so much focus on emissions, because there's so many cars out there. India, China, they're growing rapidly there. The world really has to do something about emissions. So much as we don't like it from a full driving perspective, we don't like the extra complexity, and I don't like it. No one likes it. It actually is for the greater good, but diesel is going to reach the end of the road. It just can't be made green enough.
How is that going to compare then with petrol? Because so one of the big things I find is, like, with my Jeep Patriot, and that was probably 5 or 6 years ago, I was getting 6.5 to 7 litres per 100. And it's not a big vehicle, but it's not a small vehicle either. And on a good highway run, a couple of times I nudged under 6, so I was seeing 5.9 litres per 100, which that's pretty amazing economy. Is it still is diesel still more polluting when you're getting those? Because, and this is the thing that a lot of people driving petrols have, and from what I found as well, they're very expensive to run a petrol car. The economy is just nowhere near there.
Well, it's getting closer now. Diesel still does hold an efficiency gain, and there's a couple of reasons for that. There's actually more energy in a litre of diesel than there is a litre of petrol. Not a lot more, but a little bit more energy in diesel. Secondly, diesel can go to a higher compression ratio. So when you get that fuel-air mixture inside the cylinder, then it compresses to a greater degree in petrol. And the reason for that is that diesel is compression ignition. So basically it compresses everything. You inject the fuel, bang, it goes, and round you go. Whereas obviously petrols don't work that way. They use spark plugs. So there's a couple of reasons why diesel engines are definitely more efficient than petrol engines, and efficiency increases as loading increases as well. Now, petrol engines are starting to narrow the gap, because a lot of the work in diesel engines actually goes towards just meeting emissions. So the engineers consider themselves pretty happy if they can get a tiny power and torque increase whilst meeting the next set of Euro standards there. Whereas the petrol, it's easier to meet those standards and not quite as stringent, mainly because of the particulates we talked about earlier on, and there's a bit more leeway there. And petrols themselves are becoming more and more efficient in all sorts of different ways as well. There's just a bit more focus going on in that area.
Interesting. And so, really, realistically, petrol is probably on the way out too as well, then, one would have thought? Like, will become, as more and more countries and states, like particularly California, mandate electric vehicles? How do you see that sort of panning out?
Look, petrol's on the way out as well. Diesel's going to get to the door first and go out through the door, but the door's going to be left open, and petrol will be following diesel out at some point in the future. And you could just look at the news. So the UK just said by 2040, which is not that far away now, it doesn't want to have any more pure petrol or diesel cars on sale. They have to be hybrids or pure electric. Volvo have just come out and said, after 2019, we're not going to make any more petrol or diesel. We're doing hybrids or electric only. Now, every so often, the mayors of some really big cities get together and have their mayoral conference, and the mayors of Paris, Athens, Mexico City and Madrid said, after 2025, we are not allowing diesel cars in our cities. So every month now, there's some form of similar pronouncement about we're not going to allow diesel to do this, or we're going to switch that. And just, if you look at the car press releases, it's all about electric hybrids. That's where it's at. That's where it's going to be, and it's because of the emissions. And also, the technology is massively picking up. Batteries are way better than what they used to be. The regeneration capabilities way better than what they used to be. And look at where electric is going. I mean, I don't know if you've ever used an electric chainsaw. It's great. I think it's better than a petrol one, for example. If you've ever driven a Tesla, the acceleration on that is absolutely phenomenal. It's where it's going. I've even got a little radio-controlled rock crawler, which I love, and just seeing how easy that is to manoeuvre, how precisely you can meter out the torque in the electric engine, it really kind of makes you a believer out of it.
So this leaves us in a very interesting space then for the long-term viability of the four-wheel drive market, doesn't it? Because I know a lot of people are going to be disappointed when they lose diesel four-wheel drives, although it's interesting because we put a post up on 4x4 Earth and a lot of people have been saying that the latest generation of diesels have been awful anyway, and probably a lot of that is because of these trying to meet these emission control guidelines. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and Tom? Well, I don't think that the latest generation of diesels are awful. I think they're the best they've ever been. They're smooth, quiet, powerful, very linear torque delivery. So I don't really see where that's coming from. Where I do see is complexity, which we've talked about before. What's interesting now is that over the last 5-6 years, we've seen petrol four-wheel drives being phased out. So there's no longer a petrol Mitsubishi Pajero, for example. Petrol four-wheel drive utes are pretty much non-existent there as well. Nissan brought out the Y62 Petrol and got kicked from here to Kingdom Come because there was no diesel on it. And Haval brought out their diesel-only H9, which is not a bad car, I might add. And, everyone just scoffed at that. So the Chinese car is petrol only. But you know what? I think that's actually the right move. And Toyota are pretty much the only holdouts with petrol, and I think that's really smart on their move. They're still offering the Petrol 200 series and Hilux and everything else. And those cars are good. I mean, they're quiet, they're powerful. I think that people should be looking at petrol. If you don't need that long range there, save yourself the money. And if it costs you $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 less to buy a petrol, you're going to do a lot of driving to get that money back. A lot of driving.
So what is an electric four-wheel drive going to look like, though?
Well, I think that the big threat to what we know as four-wheel driving isn't electricity, it's actually autonomous driving, because I guess you've got to kind of split your four-wheel drivers into two here. First of all, there's the four-wheel drivers who own a four-wheel drive and just want to use it to get somewhere, and they don't care whether it's a helicopter or hovercraft or a patrol, right? Just want to get somewhere. Now, for those people, if it's a fully autonomous electric four-wheel drive, that's fine, right? There's more time to post Facebook statuses on the way to their fishing spot, whatever they're going to do. They don't care. Now, the other type of four-wheel driver is the sort of camp I'm literally in, and that is the car enthusiast. And we get our enjoyment not only from travelling through the countryside and the camping and so forth, but also from the joy of achieving and doing something skillful and the satisfaction when you get it right. It's like driving a car on a racetrack, right, or sailing a boat, or whatever the case may be. You set yourself a skillful challenge. When you do it right, you feel satisfied, and that's your enjoyment. And if you've got a fully electric, hyper-capable, semi-autonomous four-wheel drive, then there is very little driving challenge, and therefore there is very little enjoyment. So I think from an enthusiast's point of view, that is where the threat to what we know four-wheel driving is going to come from in terms of enjoyment. I don't see a direct threat to our ability to get out into the bush and to do camping and so forth and things like that. But I think that the fun of driving a four-wheel drive will start to dissipate.
It will be interesting. I think so. One of the issues is going to be as one of the So the Australian market is effectively an outlier in the fact of the number of diesels that we're selling here now then, really, isn't it?
Yes, because it will become increasingly that way because America never really embraced diesel and now they never will. Middle East, obviously they're sitting on top of oil reserves like unbelievable, so they never butted with it either. South Africa is the same as us, by the way, pretty much diesel-oriented. Europe was and still is massively diesel-oriented because for quite a while this, diesel's better than petrol. You know, yes, there's a few more particulates, but it's so more efficient. So they went massive diesel. Over there, everything's diesel. Tiny little runabout cars, which we'd never have of diesels, they've got diesel. So literally everything's diesel over there. But now they've completely swung the other way and they've gone, no, we're ditching it with those announcements that I said there. So Australia is going to be pretty much out on a limb there. And it's interesting to see what's happening with the Euro standard. So the Euro standard for Euro 5 requires a DPF, and that's why the Land Cruiser 70 series had one fitted in the end of 2016, so it's now got a DPF. Euro 6 requires SCR AdBlue, so the next round of engines, when Euro 6 becomes law in Australia, will have to have SCR and AdBlue, and that's going to go down well with four-wheel drivers. Ford Everest already has it, and Ram Army already has it. So, yeah, we will be seeing a lot. This isn't going to stop, basically. We're just going to see more and more stringent emissions, and that's going to drive more and more fuel-efficient vehicles.
Because I'm thinking that if they would have stopped almost virtually selling them in France. If you're not going to be able to drive a diesel in Paris, the market for diesels in Europe would have had to have collapsed.
Yeah, look, I don't have any data on that, but yes, you'd be correct, which is that if you've got these cities banning them, it's fair to say that the ban isn't going to be lifted, and there's only going to be more cities banning them, and at some point there might even be a bit of a social stigma towards it as well. And then you've got all of the effort going away from diesels into petrol electric hybrids. So, yeah, I wouldn't be investing in diesel technology if I was some form of venture capitalist anytime soon.
A few people on the forum have asked, is it worthwhile getting a diesel now if you're planning on holding onto it for 12, 15 years? I wonder when is it going to start to get more difficult to get diesel? I mean, because there's not a lot of diesel pumps now at the servos anyway. I'm wondering when they're going to start taking those out.
I don't think we're anywhere near that. I haven't noticed a reduction in diesel pumps. I don't think we're anywhere near that. Look, I'd absolutely buy a brand new diesel now and run it. There's no question about that. What we're talking about here is the reduction of diesel availability into the future. But if you've got one now, you'll be able to run it indefinitely. I can't see any point at which the government's going to go, okay, no, that car's too old. You're going to have to take it off the road. Maybe if it's 40 years old or something like that, but I don't think any of us plan too far 40 years into the future. I certainly don't anyway. So, no, I wouldn't have any hesitation in buying a diesel now. And in fact, it might actually be the smarter time to buy diesel now before they start getting even more complicated and running it into the future.
When does the latest Euro standards become law in Australia then, do you know?
Yeah, good question. So the Euro 5 is in at the moment, and I and reliably informed that there were some shenanigans and lobbying by certain car manufacturers who shall remain nameless in order to delay that a bit so they could get their cars in order. Euro 6, I'm not 100% sure when that's going to come in. That came in September 2014 in Europe. And but yeah, so when the standard comes in, basically from the time the standard comes in, no new cars are allowed to be sold unless they meet that standard. Now, Euro 6 requires AdBlue, and clearly not a lot of cars don't have AdBlue or SCRs, it's more correctly known at the moment. So, yeah, that's going to be another sort of big blow to the market there.
And see, the other thing I was thinking about is, has the Dieselgate, has VW and the other manufacturers, because they weren't the only ones caught in it, has that made them shy away from diesel? Are they just going to think the whole diesel thing is just too hard?
Yeah, look, that's a really astute observation. And we don't know why Dieselgate happened. Why did VW and actually others go to the point of cheating on these things? Well, the answer is because it's so bloody hard. Right? And imagine that you're using electricity in your home, right? And then someone comes along and says, okay, how much electricity are you using at the moment? In 2 years' time, I want you to use half of that. Another 2 years after that, half again. And 3 years after that, we'll give you 3 years this time. We want it to be half of that again. What would you do? I mean, you've got to start using electricity, more efficient appliances, get solar power in. It's a big, expensive investment. And these days, the engineers are pretty happy if they can produce an engine that has just a marginal increase in power and torque and meets the new emission standards. So, yeah, I've got no doubt that VW were looking at that going, geez, how on earth are we going to meet this? And resorted to the cheating that they did. It doesn't in any way, shape or form excuse their dishonesty, and they deserve every bit of the kicking they have received and will receive for it, but you can well understand what it is. But Dieselgate didn't kill the diesel. All it did was just accelerate the process a little bit.
It's interesting. I was doing a little bit of reading up on it, and the nitrous oxide emissions, so they were reduced during the testing. Real world conditions, they were 40 times higher. So it wasn't a little bit of programming that they did to just sort of squeeze by. They decreased them to 5% of what they are in real conditions, that's a massive difference.
Yeah, it is. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing, nitrogen oxide, it's a really poisonous gas. But, I guess if you're going to cheat, you may as well really cheat or make it worth your while. So, yeah, I guess maybe that was their logic there as well. But it's pretty easy to detect when the car's on the roller because it's in such prescribed conditions, the car can detect when it's in those conditions and go into a special mode, and then off you go. Easy enough to do. But, all of that's kind of a footnote in the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that the world desperately needs lower emissions vehicles, and the way to do it is hybrids. And what we're going to see is, at the moment, we've got your standard internal combustion car, be that petrol or diesel, and tacked onto it is an electric motor with regeneration under brakes and all of that good stuff. Okay. That's more or less where things are at the moment. Now, there's a couple of outliers with that. We've got Tesla, obviously, pure play electric vehicle there. Things like the Nissan Leaf have been built ground up as an electric car, Mitsubishi IREV, and there's even a four-wheel drive, actually, the Bollinger B1 SUT, because the world needs another acronym. And even Tomcar in Australia have produced an electric version of their offloader. But by and large, the market today is at your standard car with your hybrid technology tacked onto it. Now, that's going to shift to the point where you get more and more ground-up vehicles where the primary motor is an electric and the secondary motor is an internal combustion engine, but then that internal combustion engine will get smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where it's actually not there anymore. So that's what we're going to see over the next 10, 15 years or so.
And because the flip side of that, of course, is because I don't think they're going to be practical at all from a four-wheel driving point of view, because the range is going to be incredibly limited with them as they are now.
Yeah, well, look, that's the thing. I mean, range anxiety, I don't agree with range anxiety at all for commuter vehicles, because most people, the vast majority of people, commute well under 100 kilometres to and from what they're going to do on a day-to-day basis. And electric cars are well within that range now. Even if you don't charge them at your destination, you just drive them back. So range anxiety is not really, it's an overblown thing for commuters and sort of around town stuff. But it's a real problem for four-wheel drivers because we have bigger, heavier vehicles with much greater loads. We tow and we travel much greater distances than 100 kilometres there and back as a return trip. So, yeah, that's going to be a problem for four-wheel drivers for quite a while. So we're going to need another power source to go with that electrical load generation as well for quite a while. And I think that will probably be a small petrol engine. We can expect. See, the thing is, battery technology has got a long way to go yet. There's all the indications in the research are that there's a lot more frontiers to be explored in that. Diesel's pretty much reaching the end of its life there. So the battery technology is going to be a lot better. Things like solar will massively improve. Energy harvesting will hugely improve as well. So all of these factors are going to massively increase the range of a electric vehicle. And, some wag pointed out on my Facebook page the other day, you run out of petrol in the sense and you've got to dig for it. And whereas if it's electric, you just put up the solar panels, wait a bit and recharge and off you go. Now, look, that's probably a little bit science fiction at the moment, but like all science fiction, there's an element of truth to it.
Well, that was one of the things that I was thinking. Solar panels on the roof, obviously they wouldn't be overly effective now, but they are making significant gains with solar panels. You could quite easily, run out of juice, and as long as you've got good sunshine, as long as you're not on a bush track where there's no sunlight, you could potentially, get enough charge to be able to get out of trouble and to the nearest recharging point.
Well, yeah, not at the moment because, solar panel efficiency has massively improved over the last 10, 15 years. And again, the more people buy it, the more impetus there is to actually use that stuff. But it's still nowhere near the point where you'd want to hang out your solar panels and try and recharge an electric car. But the technology is massively improving. Batteries are going to get better. So at some point in the future, and I can't say how far, but at some point well in the future, that could be a reality. We're just a long way off sort of hanging out a solar panel to recharge a car now.
Excellent. Well, I think that we have covered this topic to death, just like the future of diesel, it sounds, which is actually quite sad. And it's given me some things to think about because I'm due for a vehicle replacement in the next 6 months. So I will be looking at the petrol alternatives a little bit more closely.
Yeah, look, there's no reason not to buy diesel now. If that meets your needs, then do so. And the advantages of diesel, really, there's two main, just a couple of main ones. First is that you get much greater range. So 100 litres of diesel will take you a lot further than 100 litres of petrol, which is great for when you're touring off-road. You've got less need for long-range tanks, where your long-range tanks take you further, which is great. And the second major advantage is it's a lot less flammable, which is good. Now, the other advantages diesel historically has had aren't so great anymore. One was, it's really good engine braking downhill, and that's true. Because it's a high compression engine, you do get better engine braking than the equivalent petrol. But these days, even automatics have got quite low range gearing. 44-to-1 crawl ratios are not common these days. So, and really good hill descent control systems these days as well. So you don't really need that amazing engine braking that diesels have as you did 10, 15 years ago. And then there's obviously the well-known torque of diesels. Well, yes, that's true. It does develop more torque. But again, petrols are really starting to fight back with developing a fair bit of torque down low. And we're also talking 6, 7, 8, even 9-speed gearboxes. So it can pick exactly the right ratio there. And that's starting to nullify the diesel's torque advantage there as well. But I'd absolutely go out and buy a brand new diesel tomorrow. No question about it. And I think that's still a very smart choice for four-wheel drives, but in the future, I think diesel will die. The question is when, not if.
Well, interesting. Maybe it'll be my last diesel vehicle, and maybe it'll be the last vehicle I buy that I have to drive. That's the other thought.
Oh, could well be, yeah. But in a way, it's going to be sad because one of the things which I think that electric vehicles miss is a sense of primeval excitement and direct connection, because everything's computer controlled. You're not actually controlling the vehicle. You're requesting a computer to do something, and the computer decides how and when it will action it. And you don't feel quite the same connection with the vehicle. It's not as direct, and there's not as much noise, vibration. You don't feel part of it. And as an example, just go to any indoor karting place and rent petrol carts there, and they'll feel really raw and exciting. And then you can go to there's a place now, High Voltage, that does electric karting. Rent one of their carts, and it's a different type of experience. You get this massive surge of torque, and it's thrilling as it pushes you forwards there. But you don't get the noise, you don't get the vibration, you don't get any of that stuff, which in a way is good, in a way it's bad, right? But it's not quite the sort of primeval thrill that we're used to. But you know what, James? You and I will miss that because we've grown up with that. We know what it's like. But our kids or our kids' kids will have never experienced it, and therefore they will never hanker after what they've never experienced. So it won't matter. It won't matter to them.
And that's the thing. It'll be one of those things from a bygone era.
Yeah, it will be. But the other thing is that people are saying, hybrids are they're really just for emissions and so forth. Well, no, not really. It's actually performance. I mean, my favourite example is the three hypercars of the world: the McLaren P1, the Ferrari LaFerrari, and the Porsche 918. Three pretty much fastest cars the world has ever seen. All three of them are hybrids, and they're hybrids because they can actually use that hybrid power to their advantage. So the petrol engine does the high rev stuff, and the electric engine does the low RPM stuff, because obviously electrics develop all their torque pretty much at 0.01 RPM. And it can torque fill gaps in between gear shifts and so on. So you actually get a significant performance advantage. And in the case of four-wheel drive, that's going to be pretty amazing. Imagine four-wheel drive with individual wheel drive, where each wheel is actually driven individually, not through a differential. And you could skid steer. You wouldn't need traction control or locking discs because it would all be computer controlled for you. Amazing capability, but again, I come back to it. Is amazing capability what we want? Don't we want some form of challenge for the driver? Because for me, that's what cars are all about. It's enjoyment as a driver.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much, Robert. Always really interesting. I always learn a lot when I talk to you. And yeah, we've covered a really interesting topic, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to be really interested in the future of diesels.
Thank you very much. And don't forget to visit 4x4.practicalmotoring.com.au, where you can find lots of articles about this subject, including one about to publish where I've talked to Toyota, Land Rover and Jeep about their views on the future of 4x4s.
Awesome. I will include a link to that in the show notes.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, buddy. So there you go. That's Robert's thoughts on diesel. I know it's actually quite controversial, but I think really the writing is on the wall for diesel engines, which is quite sad. If you're enjoying the 4x4 Earth podcasts, please rate them in iTunes. It really does help us to get more people to listen to the podcast. I know this morning when I checked, the 4x4 Earth podcast was the most popular automotive podcast in Australia, which I think is really exciting. And thousands of people listening to the podcast, which is great to see. The other thing you can do is check out the 4x4 Earth store. We've got T-shirts in there. Those sales, they really do help keep the wheels ticking over. It's a fairly large beast, the 4x4 Earth website. Hundreds of thousands of visitors, serving up over 500,000 page views, sometimes as many as 800,000 page views a month. Lots of traffic, lots of people looking for a good route, and so we need a bit of cash to keep the lights on the server. So the best way to do that is to go out and buy a T-shirt. The other things you can do, we've got a donations page. Check out the insurance tab. So you can get an insurance policy with Club 4x4, which is a insurance policy specifically designed for four-wheel drivers, and they're good enough to give us a rebate for every policy that we sell. That's about it. I hope to see you on the track someday. Bye.
4x4earth.com is used by over 200,000 people every month to find great tracks, organise trips, and find out how to better enjoy exploring the great outdoors. There's over 1,000 tracks and 300 campsites ready for you to explore. So check out 4x4earth.com today and sign up to get access to the track information, ask questions, and meet other 4x4 Earthers. Membership is completely free. If you're looking for a good route, check out 4x4earth.com today.